I could feel it building inside me. The pressure, the heat, the raw fury clawing to break free. It was an old, familiar sensation, like a wave surging up from the depths of my chest, demanding to be released. It used to be a force I couldn't control. I'd let it rush out of me before, loud, wild, untamed. But today was different. Today, I felt the weight of their eyes on me, watching, waiting for that moment when I would break, when I would unleash everything inside me in a fury they could then point to and say, "See, we were right about you." I stood there, in the center of the room, feeling their gaze like sharp needles prickling my skin. They were expecting it, the explosion, the eruption of words, the heated argument that would give them exactly what they needed. The anticipation was thick in the air, a tangible thing. They exchanged quick glances, smirks almost, as if they were daring me, baiting me, pushing me closer to the edge. I could feel it, my own heartbeat pounding against my ribs, the tightness in my throat, the way my hands clenched into fists at my sides. They saw this and leaned in, like predators scenting blood, convinced they had cornered me. But what they didn't see, what they couldn't even fathom, was the decision I made in that exact moment. I took a deep breath, feeling the anger, the fire, the words I wanted to scream, all bubbling up to the surface. And then I swallowed it down. I let it settle deep inside me, a burning coal buried under layers of resolve. I could see the shift in their expressions, the flicker of confusion as my silence stretched longer than they anticipated. It was as if the ground beneath them became unsteady, like they were standing on ice, unsure if it would hold. I didn't say a word. I just met their gaze one by one and let them feel the full weight of my silence. It wasn't the silence of someone who had nothing to say. It was the silence of someone who had chosen not to speak. There's a difference, and they felt it. I saw the realization in their eyes, a slight widening, a quick dart of glances between them. They expected me to lash out, to give them a show, to validate their assumptions. Instead, I let the quiet hang heavy in the room, thicker than any words I could have shouted. It was almost tangible, like a shroud descending over everything. They began to shift in their seats, small involuntary movements. I could sense their discomfort, the way their confidence started to waver. The silence wasn't what they expected. It wasn't part of their plan. They wanted a reaction, a response that would fit neatly into their narrative of me, and I denied them that. I stood there, calm, composed, a stillness that belied the storm they thought was coming. The seconds ticked by, but they felt like hours. I watched them try to mask their confusion, their growing unease. It was almost amusing, watching them grapple with the unexpected, their attempts to maintain their composure crumbling with each passing moment. One of them finally cleared his throat, a forced, awkward sound that shattered the silence for a brief second. He looked at me, his expression a strange mix of irritation and uncertainty, as if he couldn't decide whether to push me further or back away. And still, I said nothing. I just let my eyes linger on him unblinking, giving him nothing but the blank canvas of my silence to project his fears onto. I could see it in his face. He was waiting for the explosion, bracing himself for the impact of my words. When it didn't come, he faltered. He tried to speak again, but the words trailed off into a stammer, lost in the void I had created. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to explain myself or defend my silence. It spoke for itself. It spoke louder than any outburst ever could. The tension in the room was palpable now, like a string pulled taut, ready to snap at any moment. But it wasn't my string that was stretched to breaking. It was theirs. They were the ones unraveling, struggling to make sense of what was happening, because it didn't fit into their expectations. I could feel the fire inside me still, burning hot, but it was contained now, controlled. And that's when I realized something I hadn't before. The power wasn't in the release, it was in the restraint. The power was in letting the silence sit, letting it fill the room, letting it say everything I didn't need to. I could have screamed, I could have shouted, but in choosing not to, I made them feel the weight of every word I withheld. The realization hit them slowly, like a dawning light they tried to ignore. They had wanted my anger because it would have made the things simple, predictable. But my silence was a different beast entirely. It was unpredictable, unnerving. It was a mirror reflecting their own insecurities, their own expectations turned back on them. And that's what terrified them the most. So, I stood there quietly, watching them unravel under the force of nothing more than the silence I chose to hold. And in that moment, I knew I had already won the battle they thought they were ready for. There were moments when I almost broke. Moments when the urge to shout, to scream, to unleash everything that had been building inside of me was so intense, it felt like it might split me apart. I could feel the words bubbling up, pressing against the back of my teeth, demanding to be set free. I imagined the release of it, the way the air would crackle with the sound of my voice finally erupting, the way they would flinch and step back, startled by the force of it. For just a split second, I craved it. I craved the momentary satisfaction of seeing their eyes widen, of letting them know exactly how much their actions had hurt me, of giving voice to every thought I'd been holding back. But then I saw their faces, and I remembered why I couldn't give in. I remembered their smirks, the way they had baited me, goaded me, trying to push me past my breaking point. They were counting on it. They wanted my anger, needed it to complete their story about me. To them, I was the predictable one, the one who couldn't hold back, the one who would lash out and prove every assumption they had ever made. It was a trap, one I had fallen into before. They were playing a game, and for them my outburst would be the winning move. I realized then that the true power wasn't in letting the storm break free. It was in holding it back. It was in keeping it locked away, in the quiet that came after the lightning but before the thunder. Silence is not passive. It's not the absence of action, it's the choice of restraint. I decided, in that moment, that I wouldn't play by their rules. I wouldn't give them what they were so desperately seeking. I would give them the opposite. I would give them nothing. As the days went by, I kept my silence, even when the urge to break it gnawed at me like a hunger. I watched them from a distance, their movements, their expressions, the way they talked when they thought I wasn't listening. At first, they seemed confused by my lack of reaction. They didn't understand it. It wasn't what they had prepared for. They were like actors who had rehearsed their lines for a scene, only to find out that the script had been changed without their knowledge. The more I stayed silent, the more they began to fidget. They were expecting a confrontation, a release of tension that would clear the air, even if it was through a heated argument. But I gave them no such relief. It was as if I had pulled a thread loose in their carefully woven fabric, and now the whole thing was starting to unravel. I saw the way they glanced at each other, uneasy, trying to gauge if anyone else was feeling the same strange discomfort. It was subtle at first, an awkward laugh here, a nervous cough there, but it grew, spreading like a crack running through ice, until the whole foundation beneath them felt unsteady. Silence became my weapon. It was a mirror, reflecting back at them everything they didn't want to see. It was their own discomfort, their own insecurities, their own fear of the unknown. When I didn't respond, they were left alone with their thoughts, forced to confront the possibility that maybe they didn't know me as well as they thought they did. Maybe they had misjudged me. Maybe they had been wrong all along. And that was the worst thing I could have done to them. Not scream, not argue, but simply let them sit with their own doubts and fears. In the quiet, they began to unravel. I watched it happen piece by piece. They tried to provoke me, saying things that would have once set me off like a firecracker. I felt the sparks inside me, the flickers of anger, but I didn't give them the satisfaction. I let their words fall into the silence, swallowed up by the void I had created. It was as if their insults, their accusations, were pebbles dropped into a bottomless well. No splash, no sound, just an endless drop into darkness. I saw them start to panic. It was subtle at first, but it was there, the way their voices became sharper, higher pitched, the way they began to speak faster as if they could fill the silence with enough words that it would stop haunting them. But it didn't work. The more they spoke, the more obvious it became that they were talking to fill the space, not because they had anything meaningful to say. It was all noise, and I let it wash over me without reacting. There's a strange power in silence, a power that I hadn't fully understood until now. It's like standing on the edge of a cliff, looking out over a vast empty expanse. There's nothing there, nothing you can see or touch, but the nothingness is its own kind of presence. It fills the space in a way that sound never could. It demands to be noticed. It makes you confront everything you've been avoiding. I saw it in their eyes, the dawning realization that my silence wasn't a weakness, wasn't a lack of anything. It was deliberate. It was a choice. They started to understand that every second I stayed quiet, every moment I didn't react, was a moment they lost control of the situation. They couldn't handle it. They couldn't handle the uncertainty, the not knowing what I was thinking or what I might do next. They had expected me to be predictable, and I had become an enigma instead. Their own fear started to show. It was in the way they avoided looking me directly in the eye, in the way they spoke in hushed voices when I walked into the room, in the way they hesitated before saying my name, as if they weren't sure what kind of response they would get. They were afraid, not of what I might say, but of what I wasn't saying. My silence had become a canvas onto which they projected all their worst fears, all their doubts and uncertainties. It was a void that devoured their confidence, leaving them floundering, searching for something solid to hold on to. And I let it happen. I let them spiral, let them twist in the wind, because I knew now that my silence was my strongest weapon. It wasn't passive, it was aggressive. It was an act of defiance, a refusal to play the game by their rules. They expected my anger. They were prepared for it. But my silence was something they didn't know how to handle. Something that left them lost and horrified in a way they never saw coming. I realized then that I had found a new kind of power. A quiet power. The kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. The kind that unsettles you, that gets under your skin and stays there long after the moment has passed. It was the power of the unsaid, the unspoken, and it was mine. In the end, it wasn't what I did or said that broke them, it was what I didn't say. I could see it happening gradually like a slow leak in a dam. At first, they didn't even realize it. They were still holding on to the remnants of their plan, thinking they could salvage control if they pushed hard enough, if they kept prodding me for a reaction. But the more they tried, the more obvious it became that they were the ones unraveling, not me. It was almost pitiful to watch. The way they tried to make sense of the silence I had given them. They gathered in small groups, heads bent together, voices lowered in urgent whispers. They would glance at me from across the room, a mixture of confusion and fear in their eyes, as if they were looking at a ghost they hadn't expected to see. I could tell they were replaying everything in their minds, every interaction, every word exchanged, trying to figure out where they had gone wrong. They were searching for a reason, an explanation, something that could fit neatly into the story they had been telling themselves. But there was nothing to find. That was the beauty of it. The silence had become their prison. It was like a fog that rolled in unexpectedly, thick and impenetrable, shrouding everything they thought they knew. I could see the panic start to set in, the way they began second-guessing themselves, questioning every decision they had made. It was no longer just about me. It was about them. About the cracks in their own armor that my silence had exposed. They had expected to face a storm, loud and wild, something they could point to and say, "There it is, proof we were right." Instead, they found themselves standing in a vast empty space, with nothing but their own echoes for company. One by one, they started to crumble. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, like watching a statue weathered down by years of rain. It began with the small things, a hesitation here, a stammer there. The ones who had been the most confident, the loudest voices among them, were now the ones who seemed the most uncertain. They began to avoid each other, as if afraid that being seen together would make their shared discomfort more obvious. I watched them try to regain their composure, forcing smiles, making jokes that fell flat, their laughter hollow and brittle. They were trying to act like everything was normal, like nothing had changed. But the tension was there, crackling in the air like static before a lightning strike. They couldn't understand it, and that was what terrified them the most. My silence was like a riddle with no answer, a puzzle missing its final piece. It became the thing they couldn't ignore, the thing that kept them awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation we'd ever had, searching for clues. I imagine they must have had long whispered discussions about it, trying to dissect my silence, to find the hidden meaning they were convinced was there. They couldn't grasp that the silence was the message. It wasn't just an absence of sound, it was a deliberate choice, a void I had left for them to fill with their own fears. I could see the weariness in their faces, the dark circles under their eyes, the way their shoulders sagged, like they were carrying an invisible weight. They were exhausted, worn out by their own anxiety, by the endless guessing game they found themselves trapped in. It was almost like they were afraid to approach me now, afraid of what they might see reflected back at them if they looked into my eyes. It wasn't just uncertainty anymore. It was fear, real palpable fear, not of me, but of the unknown I represented. My silence had become a mirror, and they were terrified of the reflection. I realized then just how deep the silence had got. It wasn't just a tactic, a way to deflect their attacks. It had become something more profound, something they couldn't touch or manipulate. It was a boundary they couldn't cross, a line I had drawn in the sand without saying a word. They had expected an explosion, a fight they could sink their teeth into. But instead, I had given them a quiet abyss. They had stepped into it without realizing, and now they were lost, stumbling through the darkness, unsure of where they were going or how to find their way back. It became almost unbearable for them, the waiting, the not knowing. I could tell they were on edge, jumpy, reacting to the smallest noises, the slightest changes in the room. They were like soldiers in a trench, flinching at the sound of every distant rumble, bracing for an attack that never came. I watched them become more isolated, each of them retreating into their own little world, trying to hide their growing unease from one another. It was ironic, really. They had tried to isolate me, to push me to the brink, but in the end it was they who had become isolated, trapped in the cages of their own minds. The final crack appeared when one of them, the one who had always been the most vocal, finally broke the silence. He couldn't take it anymore. He confronted me, his voice loud and desperate, demanding answers, demanding to know why I hadn't responded, why I hadn't fought back. His words were sharp, filled with frustration, but there was something else underneath, something raw and almost pleading. He wanted me to react, to give him something, anything that would make sense of what had happened. But I just looked at him calmly, letting his words hang in the air between us, unanswered. I didn't need to say anything. The silence was answer enough. I watched the realization dawn on his face, slowly, painfully. He understood then, in that moment, that he wasn't going to get what he wanted. He wasn't going to get the fight he had been waiting for. He had lost, and he didn't even know how it had happened. I saw the defeat in his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped as if the weight of it all had finally become too much to bear. After that, it was like a domino effect. The rest of them fell apart, one by one, unable to hold on to their fragile facade any longer. They scattered, avoiding me, avoiding each other, like a flock of birds suddenly dispersed by a silent wind. The space they left behind was empty, quiet, almost serene. I stood there for a long time, listening to the echo of my own silence, feeling the calm settle in around me like a cloak. I had never realized how powerful silence could be. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the presence of something deeper, something unspoken that lingered long after the moment had passed. It was a reflection of everything they feared, everything they didn't want to confront. And in choosing silence, I had held up that mirror and made them face it. They had expected my anger, but they were haunted by my silence. And that silence is what will stay with them, long after they've forgotten the words they wanted me to say. It will linger in their minds, an unfinished sentence, a question they'll never find the answer to. And that is the legacy of my quiet, the true power I discovered when I chose to say nothing at all.